Section 16 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 16. The Call. Followed days of feasting on the frozen flesh of the old bull. In vain Gray Wolf tried to lure Kazan off into the forests and the swamps. Day by day the temperature rose. There was hunting now, and Gray Wolf wanted to be alone with Kazan. But with Kazan, as with most men, leadership and power roused new sensations, and he was the leader of the dog pack as he had once been a leader among the wolves. Not only Gray Wolf followed at his flank now, but the 4 huskies trailed behind him. Once more he was experiencing that triumph and strange thrill that he had almost forgotten, and only Gray Wolf, in that eternal night of her blindness, felt with dread foreboding the danger into which his newly achieved czarship might lead him. For 3 days and 3 nights they remained in the neighborhood of the dead moose, ready to defend it against others, and yet each day and each night growing less vigilant in their guard. Then came the 4th night, on which they killed a young doe. Kazan led in that chase, and for the first time, in the excitement of having the pack at his back, he left his blind mate behind. When they came to the kill, he was the first to leap at its soft throat, and not until he had begun to tear at the doe's flesh did the others dare to eat. He was master. He could send them back with a snarl. At the gleam of his fangs they crouched quivering on their bellies in the snow. Kazan's blood was fomented with brute exultation, and the excitement and fascination that came in the possession of new power took the place of Gray Wolf each day a little more. She came in half an hour after the kill, and there was no longer the lithesome alertness to her slender legs, or gladness in the tilt of her ears or the poise of her head. She did not eat much of the doe. Her blind face was turned always in Kazan's direction. Wherever he moved she followed with her unseeing eyes, as if expecting each moment his old signal to her, that low throat note that had called to her so often when they were alone in the wilderness. In Kazan, as leader of the pack, there was working a curious change. If his mates had been wolves, it would not have been difficult for Gray Wolf to have lured him away. But Kazan was among his own kind. He was a dog, and they were dogs. Fires that had burned down and ceased to warm him flamed up in him anew. In his life with Gray Wolf one thing had oppressed him as it could not oppress her, and that thing was loneliness. Nature had created him of that kind which requires companionship, not of one, but of many. It had given him birth that he might listen to and obey the commands of the voice of man. He had grown to hate men, but of the dogs, his kind, he was a part. He had been happy with Gray Wolf, happier than he had ever been in the companionship of men and his blood brothers. But he had been a long time separated from the life that had once been his, and the call of blood made him, for a time, forget. And only Gray Wolf, with that wonderful super-instinct which nature was giving her in place of her lost sight, foresaw the end to which it was leading him. Each day the temperature continued to rise, until when the sun was warmest the snow began to thaw a little. This was 2 weeks after the fight near the bull. Gradually the pack had swung eastward, until it was now 50 miles east and 20 miles south of the old home under the windfall. More than ever Gray Wolf began to long for their old nest under the fallen trees. Again, with those first promises of spring and sunshine and air, there was coming also, for the second time in her life, the promise of approaching motherhood. But her efforts to draw Kazan back were unavailing, and in spite of her protest he wandered each day a little farther east and south at the head of his pack. Instinct impelled the 4 huskies to move in that direction. They had not yet been long enough a part of the wild to forget the necessity of man, and in that direction there was man. In that direction, and not far from them now, was the Hudson Bay Company's post, to which they and their dead master owed their allegiance. Kazan did not know this, but one day something happened to bring back visions and desires that widened still more the gulf between him and Gray Wolf. They had come to the cap of a ridge when something stopped them. It was a man's voice crying shrilly that word of long ago that had so often stirred the blood in Kazan's own veins. "Oosh! Oosh! Oosh!" And from the ridge they looked down upon the open space of the plain, where a team of 6 dogs was trotting ahead of a sledge, with a man running behind them, urging them on at every other step with that cry of "Whoosh! Whoosh! Whoosh!" Trembling and undecided, the 4 huskies and the wolf dog stood on the ridge, with Gray Wolf cringing behind them. Not until man and dogs and sledge had disappeared did they move, and then they trotted down to the trail and sniffed at it whiningly and excitedly. For a mile or 2 they followed it, Kazan and his mates going fearlessly in the trail. Gray Wolf hung back, traveling 20 yards to the right of them, with the hot man scent driving the blood feverishly through her brain. Only her love for Kazan, and the faith she still had in him, kept her that near. At the edge of a swamp Kazan halted, and turned away from the trail. With the desire that was growing in him, there was still that old suspicion which nothing could quite wipe out, the suspicion that was an inheritance of his quarter strain of wolf. Gray Wolf whined joyfully when he turned into the forest, and drew so close to him that her shoulder rubbed against Kazan's as they traveled side by side. The slush snows followed fast after this, and the slush snows meant spring, and the emptying of the wilderness of human life. Kazan and his mates soon began to scent the presence and the movement of this life. They were now within 30 miles of the post. For 100 miles on all sides of them the trappers were moving in with their late winter's catch of furs. From east and west, south and north, all trails led to the post. The pack was caught in the mesh of them. For a week not a day passed that they did not cross a fresh trail, and sometimes 2 or 3. Gray Wolf was haunted by constant fear. In her blindness she knew that they were surrounded by the menace of men. To Kazan what was coming to pass had more and more ceased to fill him with fear and caution. 3 times that week he heard the shouts of men, and once he heard a white man's laughter and the barking of dogs as their master tossed them their daily feed of fish. In the air he caught the pungent scent of campfires, and one night in the far distance he heard a wild snatch of song, followed by the yelping and barking of a dog pack. Slowly and surely the lure of man drew him nearer to the post, a mile tonight, 2 miles tomorrow, but always nearer. And Gray Wolf, fighting her losing fight to the end, sensed in the danger-filled air the nearness of that hour when he would respond to the final call, and she would be left alone. These were days of activity and excitement at the Fur Company's post, the days of accounting, of profit, and of pleasure, the days when the wilderness poured in its treasure of fur, to be sent a little later to London and Paris and the capitals of Europe. And this year there was more than the usual interest in the foregathering of the forest people. The plague had wrought its terrible havoc, and not until the fur hunters had come to answer to the spring roll call would it be known accurately who had lived and who had died. The Chippewas and half-breeds from the south began to arrive first, with their teams of mongrel curs picked up along the borders of civilization. Close after them came the hunters from the western barren lands, bringing with them loads of white fox and caribou skins, and an army of big-footed, long-legged Mackenzie hounds that pulled like horses and wailed like whipped puppies when the huskies and Eskimo dogs set upon them. Packs of fierce Labrador dogs, never vanquished except by death, came from close to Hudson's Bay. Team after team of little yellow and gray Eskimo dogs, as quick with their fangs as were their black and swift-running masters with their hands and feet, met the much larger and dark-colored Malamutes from the Athabasca. Enemies of all these packs of fierce huskies trailed in from all sides, fighting, snapping, and snarling, with the lust of killing deep born in them from their wolf progenitors. There was no cessation in the Battle of the Fangs. It began with the first brute arrivals. It continued from dawn through the day and around the campfires at night. There was never an end to the strife between the dogs and between the men and the dogs. The snow was trailed and stained with blood, and the scent of it added greater fierceness to the wolf breeds. Half a dozen battles were fought to the death each day and night. Those that died were chiefly the south-bred curs, mixtures of mastiff, Great Dane, and sheepdog, and the fatally slow Mackenzie hounds. About the posts rose the smoke of 100 campfires, and about these fires gathered the women and the children of the hunters. When the snow was no longer fit for sledging, Williams, the factor, noted that there were many who had not come, and the accounts of these he later scratched out of his ledgers, knowing that they were victims of the plague. At last came the night of the big carnival. For weeks and months women and children and men had been looking forward to this. In scores of forest cabins, in smoke-blackened teepees, and even in the frozen homes of the little Eskimos, anticipation of this wild night of pleasure had given an added zest to life. It was the big circus, the good time given twice each year by the company to its people. This year, to offset the memory of plague and death, the factor had put forth unusual exertions. His hunters had killed 4 fat caribou. In the clearing there were great piles of dry logs, and in the center of all there rose 8 10-foot tree butts, crotched at the top, and from crotch to crotch there rested a stout sapling stripped of bark, and on each sapling was spitted the carcass of a caribou, to be roasted whole by the heat of the fire beneath. The fires were lighted at dusk, and Williams himself started the first of those wild songs of the Northland, the song of the caribou, as the flames leaped up into the dark night. "Oh, the caribou, he rose on high, just under the sky, the big white caribou. Now," he yelled, "now all together!" And carried away by his enthusiasm, the forest people awakened from their silence of months, and the song burst forth in a savage frenzy that reached to the skies. 2 miles to the south and west, that first thunder of human voice reached the ears of Kazan and Gray Wolf and the masterless huskies. And with the voices of men they heard now the excited howlings of dogs. The huskies faced the direction of the sounds, moving restlessly and whining. For a few moments Kazan stood as though carven of rock. Then he turned his head, and his first look was to Gray Wolf. She had slunk back a dozen feet and lay crouched under the thick cover of a balsam shrub. Her body, legs, and neck were flattened in the snow. She made no sound, but her lips were drawn back, and her teeth shone white. Kazan trotted back to her, sniffed at her blind face, and whined. Gray Wolf still did not move. He returned to the dogs, and his jaws opened and closed with a snap. Still more clearly came the wild voice of the carnival. And no longer to be held back by Kazan's leadership, the 4 huskies dropped their heads and slunk like shadows in its direction. Kazan hesitated, urging Gray Wolf. But not a muscle of Gray Wolf's body moved. She would have followed him in face of fire, but not in face of man. Not a sound escaped her ears. She heard the quick fall of Kazan's feet as he left her. In another moment she knew that he was gone. Then, and not until then, did she lift her head, and from her soft throat there broke a whimpering cry. It was her last call to Kazan. But stronger than that, there was running through Kazan's excited blood the call of man and of dog. The huskies were far in advance of him now, and for a few moments he raced madly to overtake them. Then he slowed down until he was trotting, and 100 yards farther on he stopped. Less than a mile away he could see where the flames of the great fires were reddening the sky. He gazed back to see if Gray Wolf was following, and then went on until he struck an open and hard-traveled trail. It was beaten with the footprints of men and dogs, and over it 2 of the caribou had been dragged a day or 2 before. At last he came to the thinned-out strip of timber that surrounded the clearing, and the flare of the flames was in his eyes. The bedlam of sound that came to him now was like fire in his brain. He heard the song and the laughter of men, the shrill cries of women and children, the barking and snarling and fighting of 100 dogs. He wanted to rush out and join them, to become again a part of what he had once been. Yard by yard he sneaked through the thin timber until he reached the edge of the clearing. There he stood in the shadow of a spruce and looked out upon life as he had once lived it, trembling, wistful, and yet hesitating in that final moment. 100 yards away was the savage circle of men and dogs and fire. His nostrils were filled with the rich aroma of the roasting caribou, and as he crouched down, still with that wolfish caution that Gray Wolf had taught him, men with long poles brought the huge carcasses crashing down upon the melting snow about the fires. In one great rush the horde of wild revelers crowded in with bared knives, and a snarling mass of dogs closed in behind them. In another moment he had forgotten Gray Wolf, had forgotten all that man and the wild had taught him, and like a gray streak was across the open. The dogs were surging back when he reached them, with 6 of the factor's men lashing them in the faces with long caribou gut whips. The sting of a lash fell in a fierce cut over an Eskimo dog's shoulder, and in snapping at the lash his fangs struck Kazan's rump. With lightning swiftness Kazan returned the cut, and in an instant the jaws of the dogs had met. In another instant they were down, and Kazan had the Eskimo dog by the throat. With shouts the men rushed in. Again and again their whips cut like knives through the air. Their blows fell on Kazan, who was uppermost, and as he felt the burning pain of the scourging whips, there flooded through him all at once the fierce memory of the days of old, the days of the club and the lash. He snarled. Slowly he loosened his hold of the Eskimo dog's throat. And then, out of the melee of dogs and men, there sprang another man, with a club. It fell on Kazan's back, and the force of it sent him flat into the snow. It was raised again. Behind the club there was a face, a brutal, fire-reddened face. It was such a face that had driven Kazan into the wild, and as the club fell again he evaded the full weight of its blow, and his fangs gleamed like ivory knives. A 3rd time the club was raised, and this time Kazan met it in midair, and his teeth ripped the length of the man's forearm. "Good God!" shrieked the man in pain, and Kazan caught the gleam of a rifle barrel as he sped toward the forest. A shot followed. Something like a red-hot coal ran the length of Kazan's hip, and deep in the forest he stopped to lick at the burning furrow, where the bullet had gone just deep enough to take the skin and hair from his flesh. Gray Wolf was still waiting under the balsam shrub when Kazan returned to her. Joyously she sprang forth to meet him. Once more the man had sent back the old Kazan to her. He muzzled her neck and face, and stood for a few moments with his head resting across her back, listening to the distant sound. Then, with ears laid flat, he set out straight into the north and west, and now Gray Wolf ran shoulder to shoulder with him, like the Gray Wolf of the days before the dog pack came. For that wonderful thing that lay beyond the realm of reason told her that once more she was comrade and mate, and that their trail that night was leading to their old home under the windfall. End of chapter 16 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.